Hello, welcome to Pine Grove Furnace State Park. My name is Chris Hauk. I'm the park manager here. The Forber Iron Company land was purchased by the Commonwealth in 1913, making it one of the earliest parks in the state system. Our park office is actually a historic 1850s boarding house. Our office includes a merchandise sales area and a small museum. We welcome you to Pine Grove Furnace State Park, and we hope you enjoy your visit.
Hello, my name is Andre Weltman, and I'm the chairman of the Friends of Pine Grove Furnace State Park and a volunteer local historian here. We're standing in front of the old stone stack. That's the heart of Pine Grove Furnace. This is an old blast furnace, so called because there was a blast of air forced into the bottom during the iron making process. This particular furnace was built, we think, around the early 1770s and continued making iron until April of 1895, except for a few economic interruptions here and there. So think of it as during or just before the American Revolution until exactly 30 years after the Civil War. So that's a long time, making this one of the more successful of the several iron smelters or blast furnaces along the South Mountain chain of South Central Pennsylvania and extending into Maryland. When you look at one of these old furnaces, you have to keep in mind that it was the center of an industrial complex. There was lots of machinery here, including the blast machinery forcing air in the bottom. There was a large water wheel here for almost 100 years that was only replaced with a modern steam engine in the last couple decades of operation. There were also other buildings attached, including all-important casting house, which is right where we're standing now. Now, the basic process is that you're loading your critical raw ingredients, charcoal from local forests, iron ore mined just a few hundred yards away, and some local limestone in layers like a cake over and over every 15 to 20 minutes. When you burn that charcoal with forced air or oxygen, it gets up towards 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and the ingredients eventually liquefy, and we have a high temperature, high volume chemical process that's smelting, not just melting. Two liquids accumulate at the bottom of the furnace, in the brick area at the bottom, which is the hottest part, called the crucible. One of those layers on top is the slag, which is a waste product. The limestone, or flux, grabs onto those parts of the iron ore that are not iron. That slag material is drained off periodically, allowed to solidify, smashed into pieces with hammers, and then basically thrown away. It's a waste material, a byproduct of smelting iron. And you can find pieces of slag all over our state park, and indeed all through the Michaud State Forest. Sometimes they used it as road fill for wagon haul roads. What we're trying to get out of this process is the iron itself. Again, at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, it's a liquid, and it's very dense, so it's underneath the slag right at the bottom of the furnace. That iron is tapped maybe every 12 hours. So a clay plug is broken open, and the metal flows out, cools, and solidifies. Now, what do we do with it? There's two things. We can let it go into molds. In other words, we can make useful shapes out of it, whether it's the components of a 10-plate stove or a pot or Dutch oven, which they made here, maybe industrial components, etc. Instead of directly casting it, the other thing we can do is let it flow into channels in the sand floor of the casting house. And these parallel channels reminded an agrarian society of baby pigs with their mama, and that's where we get the idea of pig iron. Now, those pigs, when they cool, are broken into chunks, maybe 3 or 4 feet long, weighing up to 100 pounds. And they are an intermediate product. Pig metal is very brittle, so for some applications, you can't really use it. You can't give it to a blacksmith because it will simply shatter. You can't take it to a rolling mill. So the pig iron, those long bars, needs to be converted into a final product that we call wrought iron or worked iron. And that was done as a separate step at a finery forge, such as we had here at Pine Grove, 2 miles away in our state park, was the Laurel Forge, built in 1830. We're here at Laurel Dam, Laurel Lake, one of 2 lakes in our state park. When people come here for swimming and boating and fishing, they're probably not wondering why there's a lake here at all. And the answer is that this was built by the Iron Company in 1830 for water power in order to run 2 water wheels at a finery forge. So there was a dam here going all the way back to 1830, but the original dam was not our 1968 solid concrete dam, but originally it was made of rocks and timber and dirt, or a timber crib. And in fact, it failed 3 times until what was finally replaced in 1968. So at a finery forge, you have large helve hammers. Think of a length of tree trunk with a weight that may be 500, even 800 pounds on the end. In fact, here at Laurel Forge, there were 2 helve hammers, one of which was said to be the 2nd largest in all of Pennsylvania. And you heat up your pig bars, and then the pigs are smashed repeatedly, once every second, by those helve hammers, which changes the crystal structure, drives out little bits of slag. We've burned off the carbon, and we end up with a much more flexible metal product that's sold for 4 times or more in the market. This is Fuller Lake, the smaller of the 2 lakes here at Pine Grove Furnace State Park. This lake was originally an iron ore quarry or pit. So it's very, very deep. And in fact, when people are swimming in the summertime, they can feel that cold, deep water beneath their feet. When this ore pit stopped being used in the 1890s, it was about 90 feet deep. Now, if you dig a hole that deep in the ground, it tends to fill up with water. So there was a large pump, 60 feet long, dipping down into the quarry that sat on the far end of the lake, and it was powered, as so many other things were, by a water wheel running off of Mountain Creek almost a mile upstream. Another interesting feature here was the railroad. The Iron Company built the South Mountain Railroad beginning in 1870, and it went right across where we're standing and past the modern swimming beach. It connected the iron industry to the town of Carlisle. Before that railroad was built, the only way to get heavy objects in and out of the mountains was on animal-drawn wagons. The Fuller ore pit is not the only source of iron ore used by the Iron Company. There were several other ore pits or quarries, including the Old Pit just south of Fuller Lake. It is not flooded, but is a rarely visited part of the state park. So this is Old Pit. What's interesting about it is it's an historic iron ore quarry or pit, but it's not flooded. Not too many people get to visit this special part of the industrial history of Pine Grove Furnace. The community cemetery here at Pine Grove Furnace sits on a hillside just south of what is now Fuller Lake. It was in use probably through the 1840s. Very little remains to be seen here, just the shadows of some of the graves. There are a few surviving gravestones that ended up in the state park office collection to preserve them. And there's only 1 stone that I've ever found that is still in the ground that has any writing at all. Along the edge of the old cemetery is the limestone quarry, conveniently just a few hundred yards away from the furnace, where this limestone was loaded as a flux or chemical sponge as part of the smelting operation. There's a story that as the limestone quarry expanded into the 1840s, they started hitting the edges of the graves on the cemetery along the back edge of the quarry, and that led to the cemetery no longer being used. Whether that's really true, I don't know. This is the old gristmill or flour mill here at Pine Grove Furnace State Park. This building first appears in the tax records in 1783. Now, why would an iron company have an agricultural mill on their property? Well, they tried to be as self-sufficient as possible out here on the mountainside, feeding both their human and animal workers. The Iron Company owned 5 farms on their own mountain property, one of which, 2 miles away, is today known as Camp Michaud, which has its own very interesting history in the 20th century as a civilian conservation corps camp and as a U.S. Army interrogation camp during World War II. The agricultural products from those 5 farms were brought here to be processed. This mill was water-powered, and the water actually ran into the basement to a small water wheel and later a small metal turbine. The mill building was significantly altered in the early 20th century, and no remains of the mill machinery remain inside. It was used for many decades as a residence, and the roof line was altered. Starting in 2010, the old mill building was taken over by the Appalachian Trail Museum, which is very fitting because Pine Grove Furnace State Park is very close to the physical midpoint of the trail running from Maine to Georgia. We're standing at the top of the furnace bank, or the hillside next to the old iron furnace. These old furnaces were typically built against a hillside like this in order to make it easy to bring the heavy raw materials over and dump them into the top of the furnace, crossing a wooden structure known as the bridge house. This whole area up here had buildings and covered walkways and storage areas for the iron ore and the limestone, and especially the charcoal, which needed to be protected from the rain. In particular, there was a large building located here called the coal house, which kept the coal from being wet, but also was separate in case it caught fire, which was a real problem and occurred at some of these old furnaces. This furnace bank or hillside is still stained today with fragments of charcoal dropped as they were loading it into the top of the furnace. The bits of charcoal you can see here are 100, 150 years old. In order to make charcoal, skilled workers called colliers lived on the mountain slopes all through the summer. They would take lengths of wood and stack them up in a very particular way, cover them with dirt and leaves, and let them burn or smolder in a very low oxygen atmosphere. This charcoal making process was done on smooth round areas called charcoal platforms or hearths, and literally thousands of these charcoal hearths are still visible all across the mountain today. We're standing on a charcoal hearth or charcoal making platform here in the Michaud State Forest near Pine Grove Furnace. These areas for making charcoal are typically about 30 feet across. They're perfectly round and perfectly flat. The rule of thumb was that it took 1 acre of forest clear cut to make enough charcoal to run the old iron furnace for 1 day, so 1 acre a day. And for this reason, the old Ironmasters would never admit to owning enough forest land to keep supplying charcoal fuel for their furnaces. This is the Paymaster's cabin at Pine Grove Furnace State Park. Today it's a rental cabin that sleeps 6 people, but originally it was part of the iron making operation where the clerk lived and had his office. There were important records and money kept here, so it has very thick walls. You'll notice that there's a double set of stairs leading up to a split door on the 2nd floor. Those stairs are where the workers went to record their weekly wages, but it was not primarily a cash-based system. So the workers would go up to that door, the clerk would note how many hours they had provided for the iron company, and then the workers would come back down, probably without any cash in hand. The idea is that over at the company store, directly next to the Ironmaster's mansion, there was another book that recorded the purchases that the workers or their families had made, and these 2 books could get out of balance. So if a worker wasn't careful, they might end up owing more to the company than they were making. This is the general store at Pine Grove Furnace State Park. Originally, there was a company store next to the mansion, but it burned down in 1915, and the public store was transferred into this building, which was originally a mule stables. There were many such stables and other agricultural buildings all across the area. The general store is famous today because Appalachian trail hikers pause here to have the half-gallon challenge. They try to eat a half-gallon of ice cream in one sitting if they've made it to the midpoint in their hike between Georgia and Maine. This is the beautiful Ironmaster's mansion at Pine Grove Furnace. These Ironmaster's mansions were typically built on a hillside near the furnace, both as a practical matter so that the Ironmaster, an investor, an owner, an operator of the furnace, could literally oversee what was going on, but also as a matter of social display. So we're literally at the top of the social pyramid here. This particular mansion was built in a 2-year period from the spring of 1827 to the spring of 1829 by an ironmaster named Peter Ege, or Ege, E-G-E. The Ege family were very prominent ironmasters in south central Pennsylvania, and Peter's father, Michael, had first become involved in Pine Grove Furnace in the early 1780s. He died in 1815, and Peter became the ironmaster here until the 1830s, when he went bankrupt because of an economic downturn called the Panic of 1837. This mansion is built of bricks that were manufactured right here on site using local materials, and it is a very impressive building. Let's take a quick look inside. Today, the mansion is run by the Appalachian Trail Museum Society. It's used as a hostel or overnight guest house for hikers, and also is available for rental for weddings and other special events. One of the dormitory bunk bed arrangements, as you see here, is actually in the fanciest room in the entire mansion. This was probably the fancy parlor where special guests would have been invited after they came in the front door through the foyer. And you can see that there's a beautiful marble surround, although it's now cracked, for this fireplace. And the only arches inside the building are these two beautiful sets here. We're standing inside the old kitchen in the Ironmaster's mansion at Pine Grove Furnace. A notable feature of this 1829 mansion is the very large cooking fireplace, which even for an old house like this is remarkably wide. You'll notice we have an old Peter Ege stove and an original cast pot, probably made right here at the furnace. These are the only original objects inside this mansion. As we look at the Ironmaster's mansion here, the top of the social hierarchy, it's an opportunity to also consider the very bottom of the social strata at this ironworks. Many of the early ironmasters were slaveholders, and part of the story of Pine Grove Furnace are the enslaved workers who were here. Now that predates this mansion by a number of decades, but even Peter Ege, the guy who built this mansion in 1827 to 29, was himself a slaveholder and slave manager in the early 1800s. He personally owned at least 3 slaves. Those enslaved workers were also accompanied by some indentured servants. Those would be poor, white, German or English or Irish workers who came across the Atlantic for a period of just a few years of servitude. Slavery at Pine Grove Furnace peaked in the year 1810, when just about half the workforce, 14 out of 30 workers in the core operation, were enslaved. Many of those people were leased from other slaveholders elsewhere in the county. Considering the history of enslaved workers here at Pine Grove Furnace, it's all the more interesting that just a couple generations later, Pine Grove Iron Works was a documented stop on the Underground Railroad. There were strong connections between the southwest corner of Cumberland County and northern Adams County, where both the Quaker communities and the free African American communities around Caledonia Furnace were part of the network. There's a certain mythology that has grown up that fugitives heading north stayed inside the mansion in the antebellum years. In particular, there's a story that they stayed in the basement in a secret little room. However, it doesn't make a lot of sense because this was the most prominent, visible part of the entire community. There were probably smarter places for fugitives to stay in various outbuildings and stables.